So welcome today. It's good to see so many of you. To introduce Katrina Kezios, who is our candidate for today and speaker. Dr. Kezios is an epidemiology and postdoctoral fellow for in our department. And prior to her postdoc, she got a PhD with one of our alums almost exactly 3 years ago, which seemed like time flew. I had to be reminded of that. And she was a T32 fellow in the Life Course Environmental Epidemiology Training Program that in fact leads, and her postdoc is now led by Adina. Her research focuses on life course drivers of health outcomes and disparities, with emphasis on examining how chronic exposure to social and financial stressors, really important stuff, harms cognition and may impact dementia risk. In much of her work, she leverages causal inference frameworks and approaches to clarify and address various methods challenges in life course research. She also conducts meta-research studies. We do more and more of those, inspired by her experience teaching epidemiologic methods. On the whole, her program of research integrates life course and social epidemiology with methodological and pedagogical perspectives that serve to strengthen evidence and improve understanding of life course determinants of health and aging. And I will also add that you were one of the very first people I met when I came to Columbia. So it's a joy to see this, to see you presenting now.
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction, Charlie, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to give this talk today. So the way I've planned it is I'm going to give a little bit of background into my training and my overarching research agenda, and then I'll spend most of the time talking about my research experience to date, and giving examples of research I've done kind of within 3 main focus areas, and I'll end with a bit of discussion about sort of what I see as next steps and future steps for my research. And then I saved a little bit of time at the end to talk about teaching and mentoring, including my teaching goals and experience, and a little bit about my teaching philosophy. So for those who don't know me, I did complete my doctoral training here in the department, and much of my substantive training was in life course theory and methods through that T32 fellowship, although kind of over the course of my training, I also gained experience in training in social determinants of health research, and epidemiologic methods, especially causal inference theory. And I also gained considerable teaching experience over the course of my time here. I'm currently a postdoc here, and my research focuses on life course experiences of financial hardship and their association with cognitive decline and other aging-related outcomes. And I do a bit of methodologic work related to longitudinal cohort pooling. I was also very recently awarded a Pathway to Independence Award. So I'll give some more information about that kind of toward the end of the talk when I talk about my research directions. So over time, my long-term research agenda has really developed around these 3 goals, which are that I want my work to strengthen evidence in epidemiologic research, to improve understanding of life course determinants of health and aging, and to improve outcomes and equity in health and aging. And so to address these goals, my research agenda really integrates my training, my pre and postdoctoral training in life course, social and causal theory, as well as epidemiologic and meta-research methods. And my experience kind of in the classroom, especially teaching in epidemiologic methods courses, has also really influenced how I think about and approach my research, which is primarily through kind of a methodologic and pedagogic lens. And so within that overarching research agenda, over the course of my training, I think my research has really developed along 3 main lines or 3 main focus areas. I do a lot of applied research broadly in the area of life course social determinants and mechanisms of healthy aging. I've been building a more methods focused research portfolio, building on my background in life course and causal theory, that aims to address challenges and data gaps in life course research. And then again, my interest in methods and my teaching experience have together sort of inspired this stream of research that I call my pedagogic and meta research in epidemiology. And so I'm going to spend the bulk of my time today walking through examples of work I've done in each of those three focus areas, starting with my applied work. So just to give an overview, throughout my training, my applied research has broadly focused on life course determinants of health. My earliest work really focused on how things people are exposed to during pregnancy impacts their offspring's outcomes at birth and from childhood through adolescence. And so a lot of the work that I focused on here looked at things like exposure to toxins like DDT and PCBs and how they were related to adverse pregnancy outcomes. And I think something that's also important to highlight here is that this early work really introduced me to the environmental health justice framework, and that sort of sparked my broader interest in learning more about social determinants of health research. So then later in my predoctoral training, to gain more experience in this area, I worked on a study that examined and looked at life course social determinants and mechanisms underlying the production of midlife physical and mental health outcomes and disparities in a birth cohort that we followed up at age 50. And a lot of my applied work at this time focused on things like life course socioeconomic status, including work that I led that tested various operationalizations of allostatic load as a marker of weathering in this cohort. And then finally, I touched on this a little bit before, but now in my postdoc, I build on all of this prior training, and my research focuses on how life course experiences of poverty and financial hardship impact cognitive decline and other aging-related outcomes in later life. And so this is the work that I'm going to walk through an example of and focus on today in this applied research section. But before walking through specific examples of that applied postdoc work, I just want to give a broad overview of kind of my motivation for studying cognitive decline and dementia and its life course social determinants. And so to answer the question, why focus on cognitive decline, I think it's first helpful to define what dementia is, which is a general term for a decline in cognitive functioning that impacts daily activities. I think it's important to note that dementia is a major public health burden, and there's currently no cure or treatment to cure dementia or reverse it. And so prevention is one key route through which we think about reducing population dementia burden. And there are also well-documented dementia disparities by race and ethnicity and gender. And I think we often think of dementia in a binary way, but really it's a continuous process. And so I think this figure helps illustrate that. It shows an example of what the cognitive decline over time of someone with dementia might look like compared with kind of cognitive decline that occurs just from normal aging. And I think this figure is nice because it helps illustrate that dementia is really a progressive process where over time individuals move through phases that we might consider more or less consistent with varying degrees of cognitive impairment. And I think it also helps illustrate that dementia pathology may begin many years prior to diagnosis. So then from a life course perspective, this implies that factors that occur earlier in life and are associated with trajectories of accelerated decline could be promising targets for intervention to prevent or delay the onset of dementia, or at least slow disease progression. And then in the context of identifying life course factors that are associated with accelerated trajectories of cognitive decline and dementia, my work focuses on social determinants of health, numerous examples of which are shown here in the schematic on the right. And many of the social determinants in the schematic have been shown to be associated with cognitive outcomes through various proposed pathways also kind of illustrated here. So then again, from a life course perspective, I'm interested in social determinants of health because they're experienced by many and their impact likely accumulates over the life course, which implies that their remedy or their improvement earlier in life could potentially help prevent a lot of later cognitive decline and disease. And then further, because many social determinants of health arise from systems governed by racialized and gender rules, they could also really be promising targets for intervention to reduce those racial and ethnic and gender disparities in dementia I mentioned on the prior slide. And so a lot of my work specifically focuses on indicators of poverty and financial hardship. And I'm especially interested in how these factors might exert their effects on cognitive outcomes through pathways related to chronic stress. And I'm interested in chronic stress in particular as a pathway because finances are a major stressor for many Americans throughout their life course. And ongoing financial strain has been associated with psychological distress, which in turn has been associated with worse cognitive function. And I'm particularly interested in understanding the biosocial mechanisms through which this type of chronic stress gets under the skin to harm brain health and impact cognition. And I just want to note that while the examples I'm going to walk through today don't investigate these mechanisms, I thought they were important to mention here because they're a big part of my research interest and my larger future research agenda, which I'll talk about more at the end. Okay, so with that overview, I hope the general motivation for my work is clear. And now I just want to highlight 2 example projects that I led during my postdoc, which looked at if sustained low hourly wage earning over a 12-year period in midlife was associated with memory decline in the first paper and all-cause mortality in the second. A little bit of background, I was interested in low wages in these analyses because I think to date there's pretty limited epidemiologic research on the cumulative health effects of low wage earning over the life course. But I think this could be an important social determinant of health because a large proportion of workers in the US labor market earn low hourly wages and often for a substantial portion of their life course. So in 2016, for example, a report estimated that proportion at 44%, where they defined low wage as earning less than 2/3 the federal median for full-time, full-year work. In addition, average wage growth, as well as the minimum wage, haven't really kept pace with inflation over the past several decades. Wages are also an interesting social determinant of health because they capture aspects of both income and occupation. And low-wage jobs are characterized by several health hazards that could increase risk of both poor cognitive outcomes and mortality. And then I think low wage is also an appealing exposure because policy levers exist to improve it, such as minimum wage laws. So in this work, we were really interested in demonstrating the potential kind of cumulative health harms of low wage earning over the life course, which we thought could highlight the need for policy interventions to protect financially vulnerable workers. So since these 2 papers are unified by a common exposure and common methods, I'm presenting them here as a body of work, and I'll start with kind of the cognition or the memory decline paper and then explain how the mortality paper advances it. So we used data from the health and retirement study, and our primary sample of interest here was the 1992 HRS cohort, for whom we had wage information collected every 2 years between 1992 and 2004. On average, we restricted the sample so that people had to be, they were on average 53 at the start of that exposure period and 65 by the end. And we required that participants be working for pay for over 50% of that time frame we were examining, and that they had at least 3 time points with wage information available in order to make kind of exposure histories. And then at each time point between 1992 and 2004, we defined low wage using that definition on the prior slide of making less than 2/3 the federal median wage for full-time, full-year work. And then we created exposure histories based on whether someone had never been categorized as earning a low wage over that exposure period, whether they always earned a low wage and we called that sustained exposure, or whether they intermittently earned low wages over that time frame. For this 1992 cohort, we also had information on cognitive assessments every 2 years between 2004 and 2016. So that allowed us to construct really robust trajectories of cognitive decline. And our outcome of interest was a validated memory composite Z-score that combined information from both direct assessments of cognition and proxy assessments. And then for analyses, we used confounder adjusted linear mixed effects models with random intercepts to model memory decline over time for each of the low wage exposure groups. And we considered multiple confounder adjustment sets. And then finally, in this paper, we also performed a validation study where we took the 1998 war babies cohort in the HRS and constructed it so that it had the same ages and exposure time frame. The only difference with this sample in the 1992 one is we just have fewer time points available for the outcome follow-up to build our cognitive trajectory. So only from 2010 to 2016. So the paper looking at low wage history and mortality used the same HRS cohorts, and it focused on the same exposure timeframes. And we ended up combining the 2 cohorts in this analysis as well as analyzing them separately. One main difference in this paper and the former one is that here we looked at multiple different definitions of low wage exposure. So this definition shown here ended up being a more conservative definition than the less than 2/3 approach I talked about previously, but we found out it's more commonly used throughout a number of different literatures. So we led with it in this paper, although we looked at low wage, we operationalized it a number of different ways and results were really consistent no matter how we looked at it. And then our outcome here was all-cause mortality, which is well validated in HRS using next of kin reports and the National Death Index. And we extended the outcome period here to be up until 2018. And then we use confounder adjusted Cox proportional hazards models and additive hazards models to estimate the hazard ratios and the excess deaths per 10,000 person years associated with low wage earning. And then confounder adjustment sets here and in the prior paper included things like basic sociodemographics, health indicators and behaviors, and then other economic and occupation related covariates. And then finally in this paper, we also performed subgroup analyses. So we looked at our findings within straight up gender and also employment stability over that same time frame. So I'm just going to briefly go through the key findings of each study in turn. For the study of low wage earning and memory decline, we observed that the rate of memory decline for the workers who never earned a low wage, which is the time effect in our models, was negative 0.12 standard deviation units. And compared with this, the rate of memory decline for workers who intermittently earned low wages looked about the same. But for workers with sustained low wages, their rate of memory decline over the same time frame was faster, and that difference was statistically significant. And if we're willing to assume that the rate of memory decline for the never low wage group represents what we would consider like normal aging, then we can reframe this difference and reinterpret our results to mean that we saw that workers with sustained low wage exposure experienced about 1 excess year of memory aging per 10-year period compared with never low wage workers. And I don't show it here, but the findings were really similar in the 1998 cohort as well, the conclusions. Okay, so for the mortality findings, on the left, I'm showing crude results for the overall sample and for each subgroup of interest. And this figure plots the excess deaths per 10,000 person years in each low wage exposure group. So those are the yellow and the blue bars showing the excess. We can compare that with the rate occurring in the kind of the baseline rate or the never low wage group, which are the gray bars. And so by kind of comparing across these bars or looking at the ratio of the yellow and blue bars to the gray bars, we can kind of get a visual sense that workers with sustained low wages kind of over that exposure period have both highest absolute and relative mortality in most subgroups, but that this is especially true for the workers whose low wages occurred in the context of unstable employment. And the confounder adjusted survival curves on the right tell a similar story. The hazard of mortality was especially high here, again, and it was robust to various confounder adjustment sets for the workers with employment fluctuations. And the findings from the additive hazard models, which can incorporate confounder adjustment, tell a similar story. So overall, across both of these studies, our findings suggested that sustained low wage earning in midlife was associated with accelerated memory decline in the first paper and increased mortality risk in the second. I think a key advantage of using the HRS for these analyses is that at least for the subcohorts we examined, we had really nice outcome follow-up, detailed cognitive assessments and mortality ascertainment occurring every 2 years over the kind of time period. And for the time frame that HRS examines, which is 50 plus, we also have really nice detailed information on finances, again, collected every 2 years as well. But I think a key challenge in this study is that using this cohort, we're only getting wage information from midlife on, even though ultimately what we care about are the later life health effects of wage earning over the entire life course or the entire working life course, and especially during peak earning years, which largely begin before age 50. This challenge is not unique to our studies. It's kind of an issue in life course research more generally, or it can be, that many longitudinal cohorts we work with have the exposure information we want, or they have the outcome information we want, but they don't always have both. And even when they do have both, it may not be kind of repeatedly collected in the cohort across the full lifespan, which would be kind of the ideal for doing robust life course analyses. And so then in the absence of having this ideal, the question becomes, is there another way we can get at it? And so longitudinal cohort pooling has become kind of a growing priority and interest area in the field to try to address this issue by pooling information from across multiple existing longitudinal cohorts to construct this ideal life course cohort in a piecewise fashion. And so this topic of like longitudinal or life course cohort pooling, I use them kind of interchangeably, is something I've been working on in my postdoc. And this research is in part informed by my applied research, but is largely part of my methodologic focus area. So I want to give an example of this methodologic work now. And so I'm going to talk about a simulation study I've been working on that looks at this task of life course cohort pooling through the lens of causal inference. But just to be clear again about what I mean by longitudinal cohort pooling, in general, I'm talking about a scenario where multiple longitudinal cohorts that cover different life periods and partially overlap in age are combined to create a cohort with complete life course information. And visually, I think this figure on the bottom left, which comes from an article by Ning et al., helps illustrate this task. And so, for example, these cohorts contain information at different periods of the life course, and often the goal is to impute individuals' exposure information at unobserved times. So like these gray dashed bars, and often this ends up being like trying to impute earlier life exposures based on individuals in other cohorts who have this information collected at those time points. And so the overarching goal then in this combined cohort is to be able to make inference about the life course effects of some exposure on some outcome later in life. And so to be able to do this task with validity requires attention to causal assumptions beyond those that exist in just a single cohort. But in kind of many of the existing life course pooling applications, limited attention has been paid to causal assumptions, and not many of them approach this through a causal framework. And so to fill that gap, one of the main methodologic problems that I've been working on in my postdoc is to try to approach this task of linking cohorts across the life course through the lens of causal inference. And just again, to clearly set up the motivation for this project, specifically, to rigorously answer life course research questions, ideally we would have at our disposal large and diverse birth cohorts with complete follow-up over the full lifespan that include in them detailed and frequently collected assessments of health over time. But in reality, few data sources, at least in the US, possess these ideal features, although multiple longitudinal cohorts exist that might encompass one or more of them, and often these cohorts cover different but overlapping periods of the life course. And so the methodological work that I've been doing attempts to capitalize on these regions of overlap to pool information from across these studies to carefully construct what I'm going to call a life course synthetic cohort that has longer follow-up than any one individual study here could provide alone. So essentially, again, I'm trying to see if I can fill in missing information for people, like their exposure information across the life course from people who are otherwise like them, but exist in a data set in which that information has been collected at that time point. So the project I've been working on, it takes this idea and plays it out in a simple simulation study where it's motivated by the following goal. We're trying to understand when the average treatment effect of some exposure A on some outcome Y in some target population can be validly estimated in a synthetic cohort in which information on A and Y don't exist in the same component data source that's used to create that cohort. And so for this study, we're focusing specifically just on two cohorts at first for simplicity. We have a data set where information on A is available that's followed people from early life through midlife, and a data set that has information on Y in it that's followed people from midlife through later life. And so these data sets overlap within a certain age range. And then within that area of overlap, we assume they've collected, we assume that they share information, meaning they've collected data on the same covariates. So along with that motivating question, there are two key points to keep in mind that guided how we designed this simulation. And the first has to do with how we conceptualize the sampling framework for these two cohorts in order to kind of be able to link them successfully. So essentially, we're thinking of these two cohorts as coming from the same underlying target population, which is the ideal life course cohort. And we're just sampling them at different ages such that, for example, the older cohort can represent the later life experience of the earlier cohort had we been able to continuously follow them over time. And so by framing our question this way, we're effectively thinking of these two cohorts as comprising the same individuals, just observed at different periods of their life, and where their data exists in two separate data sets that lack identifiers that would allow us to merge their information. And so what we're trying to do and evaluate instead is if we can link them instead by matching them on a carefully selected set of covariates that are shared between the two cohorts within that overlap region. And And that kind of leads into the second key point, what I just said about matching on a carefully selected set of covariates. Yeah, it relates to the second key point, which is that we think there is a deseparation requirement that is sufficient for this matching approach to work to enable valid estimation in the synthetic cohort. So in other words, we want to match on shared variables between the data sets that deseparate A and Y in the underlying data generating mechanism in the target population. And that could, for example, look at like this DAG on the left. And so the intuition here is we need to be able to capture or replicate these associations in our synthetic cohort to do a good job of estimating that causal effect in the synthetic cohort. And so front and backdoor pathways are the ways in which A and Y become associated. And so one way to capture those associations in the synthetic cohort is by matching on the variables that create those pathways. And just to try to solidify intuition here, especially for needing to close front door paths, which is probably counterintuitive, this notion of matching on mediators. Imagine for this DAG that we don't have available a measure of M2 available to us in both of the cohorts we're trying to link, but we want to replicate the effect of A on Y in the synthetic cohort. Well, if we don't have, or we're missing a measure of M2 and we can't match on it, that means we're going to get our estimate wrong because we don't have a way of accounting for this pathway, this direct pathway through which A affects Y. And so our estimate in the synthetic cohort is essentially going to be missing that portion of the effect if we can't bring it into the cohort with us. So if we can't close that front door path, we're likely to get an underestimate in our synthetic cohort. So those two key points really guided how we designed our simple simulation study. Again, the figure on the left is just a visual representation of our sampling framework. And then on the right, our simulation overview follows from that framework and the steps are laid out simply right here. So in our simulation, we first created our truths for our target population average treatment effects under different causal scenarios. And I'm just showing 3 here for proof of concept in the middle image on this slide. And then from that set of data generating rules, we created our early and late life cohorts of 2,500 observations each. And all of the variables were simulated to be continuous, and the relationships between them were all simulated in a positive direction. And then we created our synthetic cohort by matching individuals across the cohorts on the set of deseparating variables appropriate for each DAG. And then we estimated our effects in the synthetic cohort using correctly specified linear regression models. And specifically for our matching, we used a distance matching procedure with a matching ratio of 1 to 10. So for example, in DAG 1, every individual with an outcome in the later life cohort was matched to 10 individuals with the closest values of M in the early life cohort. And then we adjusted our variance estimates to account for the fact that we were doing this multiple matching. And then we repeated this procedure over 1,000 simulation runs and summarized our findings across all of the runs. So I'm going to briefly summarize the key findings from the simulation under the causal scenarios shown on the left. And I've color-coded them here now so that it's easier to keep track of in which cohort variables were available. And I've also added brackets to the DAGs to indicate what variables were matched on. So you'll see in DAG 3, which includes both a front and a backdoor path. For proof of concept purposes, we ran a scenario where we only matched on M, leaving this backdoor path open. And then we ran a scenario where we matched on both C and M. And then in the figure on the right, this shows our results. So each black dot represents our estimate from the synthetic cohort, which we compared to the truth in the target population for each scenario. And in each scenario, we set that to be 0.3. So the red dashed line in the figure is just visually showing the truth. And so the distance between each black dot and that red dashed line is the bias that you get in each scenario. So we see that in scenarios where deseparation is possible, matching on the variables that deseparate A and Y works to create a synthetic cohort in which we can validly estimate the effect from the target population. And that's in DAG 1, where we match on M, and then also in DAG 3, where we match on C and M, and then adjust for confounding by C in our analyses in the synthetic cohort. In DAG 2, this is sort of like the example we talked through a couple slides ago, where A and Y are unable to be deseparated because we don't have a variable to match on along this path. We see that we underestimate the treatment effect in the synthetic cohort. And that makes sense, again, because we don't have a variable to match on to bring this direct pathway into the cohort with us. So that portion of the effect is kind of effectively lost in our estimate. And then finally in DAG 3, in this scenario where we matched only on M, we see that neglecting to also match on C creates a positive bias in the synthetic cohort, which makes sense because confounding was simulated in a positive direction. So this is reflecting that residual confounding. So I think our findings here largely functioned as proof of concept, and they reinforced our expectations based on causal theory, which was great. But of course, our simulation was conducted under very ideal sampling assumptions. And so I think it's going to be important as the next step for this methodologic work to start layering in complexities that would likely challenge our sampling assumptions and therefore the success of this approach when applied to real data. So that could look like, for example, running scenarios where different selection processes or transport requirements are needed in the 2-component cohorts or however many component cohorts. And then I think in tandem with next methodologic steps, it's also going to be really important to start attempting this in applied data and in real world kind of data, because that's going to certainly present other challenges that may not even be on our radar and that we can evaluate in future methodologic work. And that's something I'll be doing in my K99. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And then finally, I think identifying external data sources or other methods to validate our results in the synthetic cohort is going to be a critical aspect of this work in the future, because in our simulation or methods work, we get to know the truth because we control it. But in the real world, we don't have that luxury. And so finding ways to compare our results in the synthetic cohort to some sort of gold standard or truth is going to be really important. And so all of these pooling next steps are actually a big part of my future research agenda, but while it was top of mind, it felt appropriate to just summarize them here first, but we'll revisit. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about my meta research work and show a quick example from it. So the two main goals of this meta research work largely are to try to do work that helps increase the accessibility of epidemiologic concepts and methods to a wider audience outside of just epi. And also, I like to use it as a place to try to evaluate the relationship between methodologic training and practice. And so to give an example of the work that addresses the second goal, I want to talk about one of my dissertation papers, which looked at, where I documented misalignments between study goals, methods, and interpretations in empirical studies in the epidemiologic literature. And just to set the stage here, I want to talk really quickly about and explain what I mean by the concept of misalignment and why it motivated this work. So in any research study, there's an underlying research process that should begin with a clear articulation of the study's goal. And that's because the study's goal really drives this research process. It should determine kind of all of your study features, but especially the estimate of interest, the analytic methods that can be used to estimate it, and also how findings should be interpreted. And then critically, epidemiologic studies can have different goals, for example, like causation or prediction, a number of other types of goals as well. And those can initiate and drive different research processes. And so because the underlying research process will differ depending on the study goal, alignment in this process between your goals, your methods, and your conclusions is really important for obtaining valid study inference. So then it follows that when the analytic methods used or the interpretations drawn from a study don't match the goal of that study, this constitutes a misalignment. And so I broadly define that in this paper as just any place in a research study where a decision is made that is inconsistent with the study's underlying goal. And I think misalignment could potentially be problematic because when an inappropriate or a mismatched approach is used for a given study goal, it could lead to bias in parameter estimates, and it could also contribute to the incorrect interpretation of study findings. And so this issue of misalignment was something I was interested in documenting, particularly because epidemiologists heavily rely on modeling to conduct our analyses. And throughout our training, we often receive our modeling advice, both from epidemiology, but also other disciplines like statistics. And traditionally, these disciplines haven't always approached this task from the same goal. And so if the context or the underlying goal in which guidance is given is unclear, that could create the opportunity for confusion and potentially for misalignment. And so that's something I wanted to see if there was evidence of in practice. So in this paper, I reviewed a random sample of empirical articles from the epidemiologic literature to document how frequently misalignments occurred between the goals of a given study and the methods used and the interpretations drawn from that study. And based on kind of preliminary reading of the methodologic literature and also research reporting literature, the two main misalignments I cared about documenting were when studies used an inappropriate variable selection approach for the study's underlying goal. And I called that a goal methods misalignment. And so, for example, for a causal study, this could look like using a variable selection approach that's entirely driven by the data, and like completely ignores or is completely agnostic to variables' roles. And then I broadly defined a goal interpretation misalignment as interpreting the coefficients for variables that are not the target of a causal analysis, or in other words, variables for which exchangeability considerations haven't been made. And this is often referred to as a table 2 fallacy in the literature, so that's how I'll talk about it. So I reviewed 100 articles from among the top 5 epidemiology journals based on a number of inclusion criteria, and I determined that the vast majority of the articles I found had either explicitly causal or implicitly causal goals. And I observed that misalignments between study goals and methods occurred in about 30% of the studies overall, although I should note that in most studies, the methods were insufficiently reported to be able to draw a concrete conclusion. So this kind of ended up being more of a reporting story than anything else. That's probably not surprising. And then alignment between study goals and interpretations was better, but still about 30% of studies committed a table 2 fallacy. And while I don't show it here, it was interesting, kind of anecdotally, that when I looked at the proportions, especially of goal methods misalignment by study goal, studies where the causal goal was very explicitly stated did a lot better in terms of misalignment. I mean, so they did a lot better in terms of alignment than in studies where the kind of causal goal was more implicitly stated or had to be inferred. So again, this paper was really motivated by my teaching experience, where I observed student confusion arising from and receiving conflicting guidance about modeling in their epi courses versus maybe their more traditional statistics courses, where kind of the root of that confusion was really just a lack of clarity in what the goal or perspective of that modeling guidance was. So it was interesting to see that this is somewhat reflected in practice. And this is something I try to be mindful of and preempt in my own teaching by clearly tying the application of different methods to their particular study goals. And this slide just shows some other examples of what like meta research work looks like, which might be less familiar than other types of work. Okay, so I want to wrap up the research portion of this talk with some details about how I see my research developing over the next few years, in large part through my K99 R00. In terms of my applied research, I think building on some of my earlier work, I really want to start incorporating biosocial mechanisms into my work on life course determinants of cognitive decline and other aging-related outcomes. And I also want I wanted to start tying my research on social determinants more closely to social policy. I touched on this before, but in terms of my methodologic work, I really see applied life course pooling and synthetic cohort validation as key next steps for this research. And kind of, I'm currently co-mentoring one of our doctoral students on a supplement that is designed to tackle exactly this issue of looking at ways to validate synthetic cohorts. So I'm really excited to push some of this methodologic research forward in a mentoring capacity. And then in terms of my meta research, I think my collaborator network here is fairly small, but it's growing. But the importance, I think the recognized importance of meta research is also increasing in the field. So I'd love to expand my collaborator network here. And I think these projects are especially fun when they're done in collaboration with students, because often it's their confusion for me that inspires the work. So I'd love to push this forward in a mentoring capacity as well. In the next few years, I think the primary way I'm going to be pushing this agenda forward is through my K99 R00, which will hit on a lot of these growth areas that I mentioned on the prior slide. So the overarching goal of this project is to build a synthetic cohort from the 3 component data sources listed here in the top panel of this figure that partially overlap in age, and then to look at the life course effects of financial well-being and cognitive outcomes and disparities within it. In the R00 phase of the project, I'm also going to be examining the extent to which accelerated biological aging, as measured by epigenetic clocks, mediates these relationships. And then the other R00 aim I have here is to construct hypothetical policy-level social interventions, which would improve different aspects of financial well-being at different relevant time points in the life course, and then estimate how those improvements could reduce later population level dementia outcomes and disparities. And I'm going to be working with a labor economist here to help me, who has expertise in social policy, to help design kind of realistic interventions, even though this is largely in a simulation context. So I think this grant's really going to help me expand my research in an interdisciplinary direction with working with, collaborating with experts in neurology, in economics, and in geroscience. And then in addition to pushing my research agenda through this grant, I'm also a co-investigator on a couple of other projects that are looking at poverty and health outcomes, as well as biosocial pathways. So those are other avenues I have that I'll be pushing this agenda forward with. And then finally, in terms of my future research agenda further down the road, I think there are still many directions that my research can grow long-term from my K99R00, but I'm also really interested now in trying to find ways to bridge the research earlier in my career that I've sort of progressively built on. I'm interested in going back and sort of trying to link it all back together. So finding kind of ways to bridge that work with my current work in dementia. In terms of my long-term research that I think my grant can inform, I think, again, the need to combine existing data sources in an unbiased way to create life course cohorts is an active kind of priority area of methodologic research in the field. And so I think there's still a lot to be learned about what is actually possible in real data. And so this is kind of a big part of my long-term research agenda in life course epidemiology. Additionally, I think a lot of my current research and the work in my K focuses on social determinants of cognitive decline and looks at algorithmic dementia outcomes. And I'm interested in expanding that to look also at biomarkers of brain health, for example, like neuroimaging outcomes, which I haven't done yet. And then finally, as I move forward in my career, again, a goal I have is to continue trying to bridge my work from across my different areas and bridging my past and my current research. And so I do this a little bit in the R00 by looking at accelerated biological aging as a mediation aim, but I plan to incorporate biosocial mechanisms more broadly in my work on health and aging, including pathways related to allostatic load and inflammation, which I have previous experience working with. And again, I'm kind of able to push that research forward in part through other kind of grants that as a co-investigator, my contribution to them is really related to those mechanisms. And similarly, I think there's some literature to suggest that pregnancy complications can impact long-term brain health. And so kind of this is an area of research I'm interested in expanding into at some point, which will bring together my earliest work on kind of pregnancy outcomes, complications and maternal exposures with my current work in dementia. So these are just some examples of like avenues I'd want to pursue to keep deepening and diversifying that program of research. Okay, I have a little bit of time to talk about my teaching and mentoring, so I just want to touch on that for a second. Teaching and mentoring have been a huge part of my academic training so far, and that's because I really love working with students and I've made it a priority and a key aspect of my training. Because of the considerable time I've spent in classrooms, I've had a lot of time to think about what, and especially in epidemiologic methods classrooms, I've had a lot of time to think about and develop my teaching goals and my philosophy. And so broadly, the goals I have for my trainees are that I want them to be able to articulate clear research questions and answer them with methodologic rigor. I want them to be able to make well-reasoned and principled arguments and communicate them effectively. And I also really want my trainees to be engaged learners who embrace both self-directed and collaborative learning. And think over time, I've tried to develop, or I have developed views on curriculum and pedagogy that I think support these goals. My teaching experience, again, is almost exclusively in the realm of epi methods. I've had the pleasure of being a teaching assistant here in the department in many epi methods courses. And my experience sort of spans kind of from the first course everyone takes when they walk in to the very last doctoral course in the sequence. So I have a good kind of bird's eye view of the method sequence. And then during my postdoc, I was also able to serve as an instructor in quantitative foundations for public health. And then listed below the table are also kind of other ways I've spent kind of considerable time engaging with teaching related activities outside of just the classroom. And all of these things I think together have helped shape my views on teaching and pedagogy. So through this experience, I thought a lot about what I see as barriers students face that impede their achievement of those goals. And in my experience, I think there are three main barriers I tend to focus on. For one, I think the way in which EPI content is presented can sometimes be disjointed, where concepts are presented as sort of singular, distinct lessons and the relationships between them is less clear. And sometimes it can be presented in an inconsistent way, and that can be kind of within a sequence of EPI courses or across departments. And so, for example, that would be like what I looked at in my meta research work. I think the other two barriers are more related to pedagogy. And so when pedagogy doesn't reinforce application, I think that can create problems because it creates a disconnect between how students are learning in the classroom and how they're eventually going to be applying their knowledge in the real world. I think the other is when pedagogy doesn't accommodate different sources of student heterogeneity, which could be things like different modes of learning or learning styles, different levels of prior preparation, different feelings of inclusion in the classroom. I think when those sources of heterogeneity aren't embraced, we could be contributing to the differential success of our students in mastering course content and kind of achieving those goals. So in response to that, in terms of approaches to curriculum that help address these barriers, I really think there's a huge benefit to rooting instruction of epidemiologic concepts and methods in principles of causal inference. I think doing so forces us to be super explicit and clear about what is and is not a causal study goal. And then because certain concepts students are learning, key concepts like confounding, only matter for certain goals, I think it helps a student better understand and grasp the context in which something they're learning actually matters. And then in addition, I think this approach helps provide a unifying narrative for internal validity. So that's because the relationship in this approach between concepts like causation and association, bias, and study design progressively build on each other and reinforce each other throughout the course versus kind of being presented as one-off topics. And then in terms of pedagogy, I think active learning really addresses a lot of those pedagogic barriers I talked about because it engages students in the process of learning by reinforcing application, and it teaches them to learn how to learn. And I think in this way, this approach really prepares students for how they're going to be applying their epidemiologic skills in the real world. It's often going to require them to be able to do self-directed and collaborative learning. And I think this approach also really embraces and accommodates different sources of student heterogeneity. So for example, I think different activities can be used in the classroom to support different modes of learning. And then in part because peer-to-peer learning and group work are really emphasized in this approach, it's been shown to be a more inclusive pedagogy because it literally creates a space for participation, especially among students who traditionally, in a more traditional classroom structure, would be more hesitant to participate. And of course, I want to note that this is just where I am in my learning, and these views are shapeable, and I'm sure they'll evolve as I gain more teaching experience down the line. Okay, finally, based on my training and experience, I think my teaching interests are largely in the realm of epidemiologic methods, and the bulk of my experience is at the MPH level, although I really do love teaching and mentoring at the doctoral level as well. And to the extent there's interest, I'm also excited to think about developing my own courses in the department. For example, I think it could be really fun to develop a course on methods in life course epidemiology that could integrate life course social and causal theory, and really dive deep into different statistical and causal methodologies that have been proposed to answer life course research questions. And then to the extent there would be any interest, of course, on meta research or research evaluation more broadly would be very exciting, I think, to develop. And that's it. No, I want to thank my collaborators and sources of funding. And now that's it. How does it work? Questions in the room?
Thank you so much. That was really great. I really enjoyed learning about all of the work that you're doing. I had one question. You know, the cohort linkages, I think, such a phenomenal, important area, and I would love to start linking some of my cohorts. And I guess the question I had was a practical one, because the simulation study you put together, was the idea of that simulation study, you know, kind of a thought experiment of like, if I had all the M's, I could get an unbiased estimate if I link these data sets together. Because in my world, no one
Have all
agrees
the
on what the
ends.
ends are.
Mhm.
No one measures any of them. And so I'm wondering like the practical
Yeah.
relevance of the simulation study to someone like me who wants to do it,
Mhm.
but who might not know all of the mediators, like these two variables.
Sure. I think I had something to say on the first part and then I trailed off.
What's the purpose of your study?
Yes, the purpose. So yes, it largely was. I think it started as like, this seems so simple. And then as you dig in, you're like, no, this is really complicated. And now all of a sudden, all the assumptions I'm making as I work through the simulation are being revealed to me. And wow, these are pretty heroic assumptions in order to be able to do this with validity. So that was like the large part was like, people are doing this. Causal inference hasn't really like found its way into this, but it helps clarify, especially like, I think it helps clarify like the importance of capturing the pathways and the like need to not match, like the age range and the period in which the two cohorts exist have to be fairly well aligned, or else you like run into like cohort and period effects and things like that that would compromise or challenge your ability to say like, well, when we link these, it's the same as if we had everyone in the target population. I think the issue of like incomplete deseparation is kind of analogous to what we're working with in a single cohort study. Like we're never going to capture all the confounders. We're always going to be worried about residual confounding. I think similarly here, we probably are never going to know all the mediators or capture all of them, but do we get enough of them to where we're getting useful information from the synthetic cohort? And so like, that's probably where I am now. So I don't have a concrete answer. Some of the work I've started in applied data shows that like, okay, well, if you have a later measure of the exposure or an earlier measure of the outcome in both cohorts, that can be a really informative linking variable that captures maybe like if there were 4 pathways that led into that, you're helping eat up a bunch of the pathways with just that variable. Otherwise, like, I think this is a place where what I'm thinking is like adding in stuff like quantitative bias analysis or bounds or something to say like, do we get useful information when we do this in real data, or do we essentially learn nothing? And in fact, are we going to make like inference that is worse than not doing this? And I don't know the answer to that. My hunch is that like when I approach I'm trying to make causal inference from observational data. I'm like, I have the key players here with my confounding. This makes sense with what I think should be happening, rooted in like all this other data and evidence and theory. I think there's surely residual confounding, but I don't know if it's big enough to explain away what I'm seeing. I think those sort of principles will end up being important here too when it comes to closing those pathways. That's my thought, but that's like also an optimistic proclamation because this is so much of my future work, so it's gonna work. I promise, stay tuned. But that's like the best I can say for now.
I just want to follow up really quickly because I think you're underselling this, right? That approach is being used a lot. And, our vice deans, exposomics, that's what they're hinging a lot of this on. So even just the ability, I think, to say this is the uncertainty is a really
useful
big deal. And so I think, I had similar questions to Carrie, but also just thinking about linking that with your applied work more, because like I imagine there's lots of us from lots of different substantive areas who are like, oh, I can see how that would play out in my work.
Yeah.
And have you thought about that kind of branching out?
Yeah. So I'm like working on a project now where I'm trying to link NLSY, which has wage information across that working life course period, with HRS boomer cohorts, so that I'm like, they're all baby boomers, and hopefully like where period effects aren't existing there and cohort effects aren't existing there. And then trying to see like, because they also have the beauty of having the same cognitive exams at 50 or about 50 in both data sets, I can start saying, okay, in my real data, what is the HRS? What does it look like in HRS? What does it look like just in the older sample in the cohort I've created? How far off is it from what it really was? That kind of stuff. I've started playing around with it. I was like, it's not developed enough to show today, but I would have loved for that to like at the end of the methods part to come back and be like, so back to my applied stuff. But yeah, that's like something I'm playing with, as well as like in the cohorts I would eventually want to link, are there ways to create comparable samples within it? So I'm like working on one that like takes the exposure time frame in the same period in NLSY and Cardia and looks at income volatility, and can I replicate a study in Cardia that looks at income volatility and cognition in NLSY when I have the same like you're the same age at the same time period, and I have the same exposure, tenured exposure period. Like, I might have different outcomes, but do I get similar enough conclusions that it wouldn't concern me to like now stack these data sets? And then, so it's going to be like stack, grow, like as we start compiling the data sources. But I think like for me, triangulation as part of like synthetic cohort validation is going to be probably the most important part of this. Like once I saw all the things I had to assume, I was like, okay, we got to start validating. Yeah. Oh.
All right. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, Laura, if you could ask your question.
Okay. First of all,
okay.
that was a great talk. Pam Factor Litbeck has a question about the competing risks of, say, mortality when looking at the synthetic cohorts. How can you be sure that the quote, risk of competing risks is constant across the cohorts?
Yeah, that's a big assumption. So that's sort of like something you probably can't assume, and you have to think about the selection processes that drop people in or out of a sample across the two cohorts. And that's sort of in terms of the method space where I'd want this to go. That's sort of the next step, is to start adding, like in terms of the DAGs, there were no selection nodes or processes on these DAGs. It was all kind of perfect conditions. And the next step for me is going to be to start making it so that they don't have comparable sampling kind of selection processes. And can I fix that with methods? Can I fix that with weighting, or CARE doesn't like weighting, but some other type of procedure to correct for like, differential attrition in one cohort than another. So that's for sure something to be concerned about. It's something that's like kind of the next step from the perfect condition simulations I was looking at. CARE.
Well, I was so excited. I mean, the first part that you talked about, the low wage. And so I have a couple of curiosity questions based on that. So, and this is, I feel like you probably, I'm sure you thought about this spot, since like this is a frequent student issue, is you're like, aha, and then label it. And this is the exposure that's causing, that's causing this effect, as opposed to another correlated overlapping exposure that's causing this effect, right? So like, you're calling this low wage. And so I was curious about, how did you disentangle it from like the body of work on high demand flow control, like that full body of work? Like, how do you disentangle? And then the second, who are like chronic non-movement workers, run into problems where like these are totally different people, and I'm just like an extrapolation plan. Or how did you think about that?
We did try to adjust for things that would perhaps be like, we didn't have job control in our analyses and stuff like that. So yes, this could be a mixing of effects, and that could be like a further, the salient component of kind of what we found.
Yeah.
We did control for kind of sequentially like other indicators of someone's financial status in which they were earning low wage. We looked at like, and some of that being like things you get from higher wage paying jobs. Like I think we chose for how often you were on employer sponsored health insurance, what your baseline like wealth was, or the skill level of your occupation, which hopefully would capture somewhat a little bit about work hazards, things like that. But there are definitely like mechanisms I want to look at from that work that we didn't in this paper. So it's like we have this association, but we should dive into it more. We gotta go.